Hi, welcome. Thanks for joining us. That's Beth over there on the left. Cindy Gershin, our guest tonight. Cindy, thank you so much for joining us. We
Thanks
appreciate
for
it.
having me.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. Folks, if you have questions, we're counting on you to fire them at us tonight. Cindy is primed and ready to answer your questions. And she has even brought her magnifying glass. So
I
you get to see what the judge's weapon looks like. Yeah, yeah.
Not too scary.
No. So thanks for joining us tonight, everybody. Appreciate it. Now, remember, mark this down and please spread the word. Tell other people 2 o'clock Eastern time on Friday will be, we'll have the 3 hour World Embroidery Day celebration stitch and chat thing. And so we have Natalie Dupuy at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock Kathy Andrews, and then 4 o'clock Barbara Hudson. I already have pictures from Kathy Andrews of things she's working on, and from Barbara Hudson, 2 new charts from her and a new acquisition from her. So we're not going to spend the whole hour with each of them. We'll chat with them, but you'll get to see some of the new things they're working on, hear about their new classes, and I'm sure by Friday I'll have stuff from Natalie too. So you get to learn about what they're working on. You get to see some of the things they're working on, and we'll just talk to them. So again, bring your questions. But remind people to join us on Friday afternoon from 2 to 5 Eastern time. Let's see that. Then Sunday's guest is Virginia Postrel. The Fabric of Civilization is her book. Beth's nodding her head because she's saying to you, get this book. It's good.
Yes, get this book. It's excellent. A great read, easy read. It's not like a scholarly book
No.
you're going to fall asleep reading. It's very interesting.
Yeah, you'll enjoy this. Yeah. Yeah, you think, all right, fabric and civilization, give me a break. No, when you read this book, it's going to really open your mind as to the importance of fiber and thread and textiles in really the history of humans on this planet. Yeah, get this book. Virginia Postrel, I'll move it close so you can see her name. The Fabric of Civilization. That's her newest book. And then she has another one about glamour.
Right.
What was that? See, here I am,
golly.
prepared but unprepared. She has another book about glamour and the role it plays, and that is, I just read little snippets from that. That looks really good. She's a really good writer, really interesting, and like Beth said, it's not some slog through a history tome. This is really good. So get it. Listen to her Sunday. You'll enjoy it. Let's see, what else do we have going on? So Friday is that. Now remember, September 1 to 5, we're going to keep telling you about this. Beth and Jennifer and I will be at the EGA seminar doing live shows. Yeah, that too. Yeah, live shows, interviews, the whole bit. So we'll give you as much of the seminar as we can from Chicago. We're giveaway tonight right up there. Usual routine. If you're new here, you send email to Gary at We Talk Fiber right there. And in the subject line over there, you put the word textured. Don't put anything else, just textured. So Gary at WeTalkFiber.com, textured in the subject line, and then put your name and address in the body of the email. Please remember that, because then when I draw, I don't have to send an email to say you won, now I need an address. So put your address in the body of the email. It's just for people who watch the live show. I do the drawing right after the live show, so benefit of showing up for the live show is to be in on the drawing if you want to. You don't have to, but you can. And so tonight we have 3 things from Karen Dudzinski at Textured Treasure, and that's why textured is the subject line, because it's from Textured Treasures. I should have kept this one.
That's brilliant.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which one?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right there, Beth, right there. I should have kept this one, but I'm being honest. Celtic Bee.
Oh.
See? Yeah, exactly.
That's cool.
I pulled that out of the
Very
stack
cool.
and I said, oh, I got to keep this one, but no. So there we have it. Celtic Bee, that's quite cool. Yep. So that's one of them.
Yeah.
Here's another one, Beth. I think this will speak to you too. Pulled ribbons. Pulled ribbons.
Oh, yeah.
Look at that.
Oh, that's nice.
Very nice.
Little pulled thread work in there. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. See, it's hard to give these away. And then chained by blue, chained by blue and gold.
Oh, yes.
Uh
Is that gold work in there?
huh. I don't think so.
Well, that's good. Yeah, gold work.
No.
Hmm.
Japanese thread, gold. Silk lame petite, gold diaro. Pearl, light effects metallic. Yeah, so there's, yeah, rayon, satin. Yeah. So the answer is yes, there's some non cotton stuff in there, but yeah, that's pretty good.
But that's beautiful, though.
Yeah.
Very elegant looking.
Hmm.
Hmm.
That Karen Dzinski, she has some talent. So, all right, so those three tonight. So get in on the deal. Send your email anytime during the show. Drawing happens immediately after. And if you don't win and you'd like these, write to Karen Dzinski at Textured Treasures. T Treasures T Treasures 2000 at yahoo.ca because she's in Canada. So if you like them and you don't win, then she has them. I know she does. She'll be happy to sell one to you. Sell one, keyword. All right, so those are the three. Get that in during the hour, drawing right afterwards, and then we'll have that. So there's that, and now we get to talk to Cindy. So that's good. Yes. Okay. Thanks to Ann Mahoney. Ann Mahoney sent in a series of questions. Really appreciate that. Something to get us going. And Cindy will drop those in, talk about them as we go along, talking. But now I saw one question in there. Somebody wanted to know if you're still judging.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
A little bit less with COVID, only because
Yeah.
things are not open, and a lot of the things that I normally judge during the year that are annual events have postponed until 2022.
Yeah.
But yes, I was actually judging in March 2020, a regional show,
Oh,
and there we had three judges. We were judging at someone's home. It was about, I think, about 350 pieces, maybe a little more. And the whole week, it was about the second or third week of March, and we're all going, all right, well, we're listening to the news, and the girls in the other room are listening to the news, going, oh, I hope they don't shut things down. I have a high schooler who needs a ride home.
yeah. Yeah.
So we made it through, and the following week, everything in Los Angeles started to get shut down, and they kept saying the show's going to go, the show's going to go. We had completed the judging, and then they ended up having to cancel it because all of the public events got shut down here.
Yeah.
But we just made it through, so that was the last one I
Yeah.
did.
Yeah. Little did we know at that time what a drawn out piece this would be.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Never thought it would go this far,
I
but
know. I know.
here we go.
Yeah, here we are yet again. Yeah, and you guys are basically reverted back, and we're headed that way in a hurry. So, yeah, frustrating.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right.
Yes.
Let's see. Do we have so? Oh, I wanted to ask you something I didn't get to ask you. I could have, but I didn't think of it at the time. So then, is the judging fairly cyclical, like in the fall with all the fairs and stuff, or is it a pretty steady thing throughout the year when people are holding events?
The fall cycle, like you said, is correct, where the fairs are in town and they seem to go one after the other. I judged a couple of them. We have a couple large shows out here that go every other year. So it just depends on, how often they want to use the same judges and if I'm invited back or not. I
Hmm.
will travel as needed. So if something is out of town, out of state, I can, they'll hire me and bring me out.
Yeah.
Just depends on when the shows are. So it's really
Yeah.
all year round.
Yeah.
December probably not so much with the holidays, but
Yeah.
otherwise all year
Yeah.
round.
But a little heavier in the fall in a normal year then. Yeah.
For me it would be because that's when our fairs are, and the other shows tend to be the other large show out here every other year, and the one prior to that was every other year seemed to be, I think they were both in the spring. Just
Yeah.
happens just when their date is.
Yeah. Are you pretty much a standard on call in California?
I hope so.
Okay.
I am at a couple of the fairs that I judge.
Okay.
They ask me to
Yeah.
come back every year, which I love to do.
Right.
And the other shows, it just depends if they would like to bring back a judge they've used or if they want to bring some fresh people in.
Oh,
That's just up
okay.
to the show committee that year.
Oh, so
I'm
some
always
people.
willing to go.
Yeah.
But if I don't go, I'll enter. So it's a win-win either way.
Oh, okay.
I
All
prefer
right.
to judge because it's fun and I get to see everything. But I enter as well. So I
Yeah.
do both.
Yeah. Work the system. Yep. Um,
Exactly.
all right. Let's see. I don't know what they're talking about. Oh, how D here I'm doing your job for you, Beth. But D Neely,
Well, I gotta move.
how to become a judge. Sorry, Beth. I was just looking. Oh,
How to become a judge?
yeah, yeah. Talk about that
Um,
process a little bit. Yeah.
sure. The way I would recommend is similar to what I did. All of the large needlework guilds, ANG, EGA, NAN, have very extensive judging programs, and you go through training to learn to do things, I'm going to say, the correct way. And you come out with knowledge, you know how to write critiques, you know how to compose yourself, you know what you're looking for, you learn about various techniques that you might not have thought to learn. Some of the local fairs will take volunteers. I don't know what their actual requirements are because I've been certified as a judge for so long that when I started working for them, I was already certified.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
go and volunteer at those.
Well, that's kind of the you hear horror stories about people who get judged, and I'm sure for all the fairs to be able to get certified judges is just an impossibility, and so you get
Yeah,
volunteers, and yeah, that can go either way.
yeah,
Yeah.
because they're constrained by budget. So one of
Hmm.
the fairs I judge at every year, when they're not shut down for COVID, I go every year. My son actually goes and works with me, which
Yeah.
is a lot of fun. It's a mother and son date. He's 17 this year, so it's not going to happen for too much longer. Um, we go out and volunteer. They provide lunch and some snacks, and and they are thrilled to death that as a certified judge that I'm willing to give them my time and come out every year. And I
Yeah.
enjoy it.
Yeah.
It's fun. I like to give people feedback. I like seeing when people enter again in following years, so I know that they've gotten some good feedback. I can see things improve, which is always a
Oh.
pleasure if they take my advice.
Yeah.
That's always good. The fairs, some of the we've been having a lot of drop off in volume on the county fairs lately, so we're trying to get more people to enter and
Yeah.
have fun and not be stressed out and do it. If you win a ribbon, that's great. If you get some feedback, even better. And if not, just let your work be shown to the public, because really that's what it's all about, is showing our work, showing that we're not just stitching little doilies and little,
Yeah.
cute home sweet home samplers. That there's nothing wrong with those. There's some beautiful ones of those out there. I'm not picking on them, but we all know that the public's perception of what we do as embroiderers is not really what a lot of us are doing. We're doing
Right.
some really neat stuff and some fun stuff. Some of the holiday stuff is fantastic, really creative. And I will try to attend shows, quietly after I've judged them if they're not too far away. And I like to sort of stand back and listen to what people are commenting about different things. Like, oh, why didn't they all win a ribbon? Oh, that's so pretty. Oh, look at that one. No wonder it won first place or best of show. And I like hearing what the public's perception of it is.
Okay. That's
I
fun.
usually drag my
I do have,
family with me, but I usually drag my family with me, but my husband and my son are pretty jaded. They know what they're looking for because
Oh.
they've lived with me for so long. So my
Yeah.
husband will
right.
whisper questions in my ear, and he'll say, "Did you notice this and this?" Yes, I did.
All right. So we got a few questions. So you said something during the podcast about if like something's not crossed correctly, like the X
Mhm.
is going a different way. So like if it's a schoolgirl sampler where there's a mistake in the chart, how do you judge that? Does that make sense?
Uh,
Like if the borders
Yeah,
don't
it
meet or
it absolutely does. I actually just finished a reproduction sampler that's reversible, and in order to get some of the reversible stitches done, you have to cross the front stitches every which way, which drove the judging part of me crazy because, when you look at the front, they're all over, but they're properly done. Um, Usually the type of needlework that we're looking at, we have a pretty good handle on. It's a reproduction. Someone is following the pattern because their stitching level is very good,
Mm.
or if their stitching level is very good, then we see that something is done. I do reproduction samplers myself, so I'm particularly aware of it. So we can tell it's not a mistake. We just make the assumption that it was part of the pattern. Something that's good to do is if the show you are entering asks you to submit an artist statement, and it's optional, submit the artist statement. That's a really great place to tell us if there's anything we need to know. You've crossed some stitches, they look wrong, but they're not. There's a few missing stitches in an area. That's the way the sampler or piece was charted, so they are not a mistake. I changed the color of my threads. I used over dyes instead of solids. I didn't like this stitch, so I changed it to that. I didn't like that motif, so I changed it to another, or I left it out. The artist statement is a great place even if you're not doing original work, it's a great place to tell us any changes you made or anything you want us to be aware of.
So that sounds to me
Okay.
like it's
Well,
not just a great place, but really important in terms of the overall process.
It is, and we do read them, because I
Yeah,
think sometimes people enter and they don't think that we actually take the time to look at them,
right.
and we do. We
Yeah.
really do, and they have been very, very helpful at times explaining things.
Uh-huh.
So we know we're not looking at a mistake, or we're looking at something that was changed from the original and why the stitcher did it.
Yeah.
and here's another question. So like, does the choice of fabrics or the choice of threads make a difference in the way you're judging?
No, it
So
is on technique. The only time we will look at fabric and materials, threads and things a little more critically is when we get to the finishing and presentation. So as an example, if something is finished as a pillow and it's finished in very, very delicate laid work with beads, and obviously it's a decorative pillow, but if it was supposed to be a functional pillow, that's not perhaps the correct choice of materials to use because it'll catch on your clothing, it'll pull apart, it'll rip what you're wearing. So that's the main time we look at that. We do look at weights of fibers, we look at colors. We do take into account whether pieces are original designs and original color pathways versus something that you've done from a class or a teacher, or you purchased a kit or purchased the chart and supplies. We can't know everything, so we try our best to figure out what it is and the most appropriate way to evaluate it. But if you're doing something on linen versus Aida, it really doesn't make a difference as long as your stitching quality is equivalent to the next person that we're judging and at the correct level to earn whatever it's going to earn. That's really all we're looking at. Same thing, I believe a question had been submitted regarding, do we make uh, any thoughts, or do we have any thoughts, say cotton threads versus silk threads? And no, just use whatever you're comfortable with, use whatever you enjoy. If your technique is good, it will shine through no matter what threads you enjoy using.
That's important
right.
to know
Okay.
because I think a lot of people feel like if I'm going to submit something and I don't do it on linen and silk, then I can't measure up, and
No, submit,
doesn't
submit,
matter a
submit.
lick. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's
No,
important.
as,
Yeah,
as long as your work is good, because we could have, say, a first place winner that's done on Aida in just cotton threads, and we could have a third place a third place winner that has been done, say it's the same exact pattern, done in silks, overdyed silks, and on a beautiful, beautiful high count linen. It really just depends on there's many factors, but in this case, the technique would really be the deciding factor as to, she crossed her. I always go back to cross stitches because everyone can relate to them. So forgive me if I keep repeating cross stitch, crotch stitch. I do know more than that. But if the one stitcher is crossing all of her stitches the correct way and her threads are separated and laid neatly versus the other one is a little less careful with the way she handles her work, that will make a difference in the scores regardless of what materials are being used.
yeah.
And Sandy asks, are there a lot of judges, and do they belong to a guild for judges or a special group?
As I said, the main places that certify needlework judges in the United States are the Embroiderers Guild of America, excuse me, the American Needlework Guild, and the National Academy of Needle Arts. Please excuse me if I got that one wrong. But ANG, EGA, and NAN. Those are the main programs that train and certify judges here. And they each have a number of judges. I don't have a head count to give you, but if you go online to each of those organizations, I believe they all have a place where you can look for judges and contact judges and appraisers and teachers, and they help promote their members so that people can find them when they need a service.
But you don't have secret handshakes and signet rings and meet in.
No.
Okay.
we may get a little pin or something to certify when we go to seminar, or something that we can wear to certify that we're a judge or a teacher or a master craftsman or an appraiser. But no, we don't. But a secret handshake is fun.
Yeah.
I think we should do that. I was formerly the chairman of the ANG appraisal program for a number of years, and gosh, I'm going to talk to the current chairman and tell her we should have a secret handshake next time we all get together. I think that would be a great idea.
There's no charge for these ideas. You just go right ahead. Yeah.
All right, and I have a question. So let's say, like, I look at my pieces and I can see the mistakes. So I've not put anything in a local show like a. Should I just go ahead and do it anyway? I mean, it kind of feels like, oh, but I see my problems. The judge will obviously see this the errors.
It depends on the type of mistake. I have things, I call them personalizations, and I personalize almost every single piece I do, including the one I'm working on right now, which is a very large reproduction sampler. And gosh darn it, I was outlining something and I'm off a stitch. I finally found it. It took me 2 days to find it. And I'm just leaving it in. No one will ever know. It's counted slightly off in a few places. I've adjusted and fixed. I figure all the little girls that did these samplers back then were changing them to each of their tastes as they went anyways. But unless it's something that will affect the count of if you're doing a border and you've missed a stitch and it'll throw everything off, if it's a real noticeable technical error, as much as we don't know every single chart and pattern out there. So I'd say go ahead and stitch it. Submit it. If it's a very blatant error, the judges will probably catch it. You'll be dinged a couple of points here or there. But it's really great to have the experience of entering and getting some feedback and seeing if there's something that they comment on that maybe they didn't notice that particular stitch wasn't right, or they didn't think it was important enough to comment that they saw you did it right everywhere else, and they looked and went, oh shoot, she right there, she made a little boo-boo. Oh well, but the rest of the work is really good. So depending on what else they're judging that particular piece again, it just depends on whether they need to dink it for a point or if it's something that perhaps they'll more or less overlook. It depends on the show and what your competitors are in your class and category. And that's in general terms.
Do it, Beth. You can do it, Beth.
I'd say enter it. Enter it. Let me know how it
finish
goes.
Something.
Send me a picture before you enter it now.
They prefer if they're finished. They prefer if they're finished, Beth. Yeah.
Well, yes.
And I think I missed all the deadlines for the local fairs here. I just
Yep. Next year. Next year, year after.
Next year. Yeah. So, and Dee wants to know how long does it take to be certified as a judge? Like for a normal needlework person.
Yeah, I don't know from the NAN program. I believe the EGA, which is where I am certified as a judge, and I believe the ANG programs, I want to say 3 to 5 years. You have certain steps that they break the program down into, and you work with a mentor that helps guide you through the program. And you have to accomplish certain goals before you can move on to the next step. So you have certain milestones that you need to accomplish and have approved before you can take your final exams and, be designated as a certified judge in your guild.
Yeah. Well, and
you need to be a member.
Yeah, I'm sure of that. Yeah. But that in itself is a real comfort, knowing that a certified judge has spent that much time and is clearly dedicated to the craft of judging, 3 to 5 years, then you know that you've got someone who's not just doing this on a lark. That this is
Oh,
serious. Yeah.
absolutely. And it really makes a difference even when I am working with people that are certified judges. I've worked with some people that are master judges, which I haven't done yet. Um, and I've also worked with people that are volunteers at some of the fairs and are knowledgeable about what they do. But you, as a trained and certified judge, I can see where my training comes in versus someone that's extremely knowledgeable on some techniques and whatnot, but I can see where um, their lack of skills in certain areas perhaps come in.
Mm-hmm.
And
Okay,
Yeah.
that's being
here's a
critical because I
follow-up to
never want
that
to
one.
I don't want to criticize someone that's kind enough to volunteer their time, but I can see a difference because I've gone through the training. So,
Right. Yeah.
So okay, this was a follow-up. Then who judges the judges? So who
well,
certifies?
we all have, yeah, no, that's a really good question. We, with all our programs, we have to recertify every so many years. So
Mm-hmm.
they make sure that we keep our training up to date and that we're reading books and that we're also entering shows so that we have, current experience on the other side of the coin, so to speak. So yeah, we all try to keep our credentials up to date so that we can do the best jobs and hopefully give everyone some good experience entering shows so that they want to do it
Right.
more.
Yeah. I love that. You have to experience both sides. That's
Oh, you
great.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
You do. Yeah, absolutely. Like I said, there's a show coming up here next year that will be judged, and I'm waiting to hear from them if I hear from them. And I'm planning either way because it's local to me here in this area. I will either judge if I am asked or I will enter. I have several pieces that have been building up that need to go to the framer, but they're ready to go and they will go in the show. So
Yeah.
either way,
Yeah.
either way.
Okay.
Uh,
Beth, I'm gonna start looking at the pictures because we're a half hour in here.
okay.
So
Right.
fit the questions in as we go, but I'm gonna switch over to the pictures now.
Okay.
Oops. I muted us.
Um,
Do that again, Beth. I
sh-
muted us.
Okay. Okay. Is there a way to find local shows besides
I
like the big
would
ones, like
check.
Woodlawn?
Yeah, I would keep in touch with some of the guilds. Again, going back to EGA, ANG, and NAN, they usually post and let people know when certain shows are coming up. They probably have links on their websites. I know they do have them in their member magazines because I'm a member of all of the guilds. Certain ones like Woodlawn, if you keep in touch with Woodlawn, you can get on their mailing list so they'll email you or put in the regular mail a flyer so you start hearing about when the entry deadlines are and what the categories and classes are and what their guidelines are. So ready to go with the slides?
Yep. Go ahead. You got the first one up here.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
All right, first one. Okay, I'm going to start out by saying that I have been stitching for a very, very, very long time. All of the pictures you see, no other stitcher was embarrassed in the critiquing of these slides because some of these date back. This is all my work. Some of it probably dates back to when I was maybe 10 to 14 years old. So some of the stuff looks really good. Some of the stuff doesn't, which is perfect for this type of work. So this one here, we're looking at an example of a stamped linen type of piece. Some of the things that I wanted to point out on this is stitch tension. You can see that this is stitched much too tight. You can see where it's puckering around the stitches, even though at some point it was pressed and put away in a basket very nicely. You can also see, if you look closely at it, look in particular at that zigzag red line across, and you can kind of see a shadow behind it. That's not thread bleeding. It's actually the threads behind the fabric are shadowing through to the front. And there's a few other places where there's some brown threads where they're actually, if I turned it over and you saw the back, you can see that there are threads that are cut, but they're not cut really small and tight. So you can see them sticking out and they're showing through the back of the fabric. So I am using this as an example to show you no matter what type of work you're doing, Make sure your work is not traveling loosely on the back for more than generally a couple of threads, because if we start seeing it come through after 2 or 3 fabric threads, then it's considered a technical error and it could affect your score. The other thing, actually, it's really good where you've got that positioned right now, is if you look under some of the threads, this one looks like it was stamped with a black outline, and some of the outline is showing. So as a stitcher, if I was entering this and doing it now, I would either make sure that that stamped outline was completely covered, or if it was the blue stamped outline, those are washable. And as long as all of my threads were color fast and checked that I could wash them without them bleeding, I would wash those lines out. So we don't want to see the stamped outlines on your pieces either.
So for in terms of carrying threads, then that's kind of what I use is no more than a couple threads, 3 at the most.
Mm-hmm.
So that's from your perspective, that's a good standard to have then.
Yes, because sometimes you have to carry them just a little tiny bit. I try and weave all my stuff around through the back very insanely because I hate anything showing through. But sometimes if it's only going over 2 or 3 threads of the fabric and it's not a super open weave on the fabric, it's really hard to notice. If you're not sure you're going to be able to see it or not when it's finished, and a lot of the things I talk about will be in regards to framing. So just sort of apply them also to if you're doing a stand-up or a finished object. But if you take a piece of white or light colored paper or a piece of cardboard behind it, and if you put that behind it, it'll help you see if you've got noticeable traveling threads on the back.
Okay. All right. Okay, on to the next one then.
Yes, please.
Folks, keep the questions coming. Don't stop now. Keep them coming.
All right. So someone did ask, do you have to complete the master before attempting to be a judge?
Complete the Master Craftsman program, perhaps? No,
Maybe.
they're completely separate. I just happened to, that's just the path I took, is I did the Master Craftsman program, and then a few years later I decided that I wanted to do more and help other people improve their work, so I became a judge. And then as I decided I wanted to do additional things and go in another direction, and I'm also a certified master appraiser through ANG, so I can appraise your work should you need it appraised for various reasons, and something else we should talk about it at some point.
Yeah, I was going to say that there's a whole other show separate, right there. Yeah,
that's a whole separate conversation I would love to have is about appraising.
Well, you're on because I want to do a show about that. So yep, you're on.
I would love to. We'll talk about that after. That would be fantastic. Absolutely.
I do before you go on, I do want to emphasize that from your perspective, and this is what I really appreciate about you, your approach to this judging is to help people get better. It's not to find fault and critique and be negative. It's to help people get better, to be constructive, to provide input that allows them to go and grow.
Absolutely. We occasionally will. I'll be judging something. We had one piece a number of years ago that was beautiful. I believe it was all or mostly cross stitch, very small stitches, and it was like a portrait of something or of someone. And we all looked at it, and it was 80 to 90% beautifully done. And then there was one little section that just got away from the person. And unfortunately, it was just enough that it took it out of the ribbon placements. And even as judges, we were like, oh, what a shame. It had the stitcher done this and this and just didn't go, not pay attention to this area here. It would have placed at least for something, and it's such a lot of work. And we were disappointed for the person that we couldn't award it a better ribbon. It just didn't fall into the right scoring range. So, we want people to do well. We want to give you ribbons. That is our goal. We want everyone to be rewarded, and we want the public to see all the beautiful work with the ribbons on them.
Yeah.
Okay, so this picture here, this is an example of pulled thread as well as beading. The pulled thread has some good features and some bad features. The bad one is pretty obvious. You can see there's some tension issues because it's, you can see especially on the sides, it's pulled in and out a little bit. where the pulled work is. I pulled much too tight. This is another older piece of mine. The wraps
Oops.
on, oops, nope, it's right there.
Yep.
We're good. The wraps, the filling stitches in the centers, those are fabric pieces. I'll show you some hardanger in a little bit with some more filling work, and we'll talk about those later. But in general, the wraps are relatively even on this piece. The holes are open fairly evenly. There are a bunch of tension issues around the squared uh, band. You can see the corners where the two squares meet. You can see some larger holes, so that should have been controlled a little bit better. So this is a good example of tension issues when you're working with pulled threads and things that would really we would deduct points from. On the bottom are some beads, which are attached pretty well. Actually, they're all nice and straight. They're all in the same direction. In this case, they're all diagonal. We don't care if you have them in diagonal, if you have them vertical, if you have them horizontal, but they must be attached, unless you're going for an effect where you want a scattered, visual image. They should be attached firmly, and they should be attached all facing the same direction. And there are a couple of different techniques that you can do that through. The way you I don't know if you want me to go into that right now, but as far
That's all
as
right.
bead
Go ahead.
attachments,
Yep.
there's a couple of, oh, sure. Generally, you would work with 2 strands of thread in your needle. You go through the bead once, and then when you go through the bead the second time, if they're placed diagonally, in particular, you can railroad them. You separate the 2 threads, and that second wrap goes on either side of the bead, and then you put the needle back through the fabric and give it a little tug, and it will seat that nice and firmly so it shouldn't flip-flop. A lot of people lose points with beads, and it's not a lot of points. It may only be 2 or 3 points or 4 points if there's a lot of beading, but beading is one of those ones where we do see a lot of room for improvement, and all it is the way you attach your beads and attaching them in the same direction and making sure they're not flip-floppy all over the place.
Okay, so that's good. Sandy asked, is there one issue that you see often in judging that a stitcher should be more aware of?
Some of the issues we see most often are missing stitches. We see things incorrectly crossed, as we were talking about, I think, a little earlier, crossed in different directions. Twisted threads instead of threads laying nicely side by side. We will deduct points if they're not placed correctly. Another thing we see, which isn't a technical issue but a finishing issue, is thread bit fuzzies and particularly pet hair on pieces, especially under framing. If you've got cat or dog hair, and I have a dog, so I'm not picking on those of us that have, I'm not picking on people with pets, but pet hair is a really, really big one. And I can't tell you how many pieces we look at that are framed. It's like, and we may not necessarily take a point off for it. Again, it depends on how the scoring is going, how many pieces we're scoring, how technical we need to be, or how particular we need to be. But usually one of us will go, oh, there's another dog hair, there's another cat hair. Gosh darn it. And then I start sneezing because I'm allergic to cats. But and then the other thing we see a lot of, particularly in framed work, is things that are, another big one is things that are not mounted straight in the frame or along the mat. And that's one of the first things that a lot of us will notice, is that the framing is a little crooked, a little out of square, or something's not quite centered right if it's supposed to be centered in the finishing.
All right, so here's something else then. Heather asks, if you have been paid as a needlework finisher, does that mean you can only enter stitch pieces regardless of the technique as a professional? Does that question make sense?
I would say that would be a question for the show committee. As a finisher, I'm trying to recall, I know as a teacher, I have to enter as professional because I get paid. Generally, if you're getting paid for the type of work you're doing in the needlework field, the general rule of thumb is that you enter as a professional, but I would actually defer as a finisher. My first inclination would be to say yes, but I would check with the show committee with the show that you're entering,
Right.
just to be safe.
Okay.
Okay, next slide.
Yep.
All right. Here is another older example of some eyelets and some open work stitch. You can see this one is still a little bit wonky around the edges. It's getting a little better. It's a little straighter. So we were working on our tension at that point. Gary, can you enlarge it a little bit so we see the first line of that alphabet, in particular the C and the D?
Yep, we can. Yep.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, so if you look at that top row, the B, C, and D, and you look inside those eyelets, you'll see several errors on the left side of the B.
Hang on, folks. Hang on.
Sure.
I have to enlarge it and hold it. So, okay, go ahead.
Oh, okay, right there. So you'll see there's some stitches on the left side of the B, on the top of the C, and the top of the D, where the holes are not clean. You can see some threads are pulled a little bit with the wrong tension in the wrong way. They're not secured properly. It could have been where a thread was ended and I didn't pull it correctly. So on any kind of open work, we will look for tension. We will look for threads that are showing behind the open work, anything that pulls it out of alignment. So I put this up because it was a good example where you could actually see that. The bands going across the stitches underneath them aren't too bad. I don't have my glasses on. I don't see any major errors on those. But the eyelet, what's interesting about the eyelets is from the first line to the second line. The second line I was sort of getting going on it and learning how to do the eyelets, and the second line is a little bit better in technique than the first line.
Yeah, I was going to say you're learning.
Yeah, exactly. I'd have to look and see how old that piece was. I chopped the date off it so we couldn't see how old it really was.
Yeah, by the third
I've
line.
been doing this a long time.
Yeah, you're pretty clean by the third line. Yeah, look at you.
Yeah.
So that's pretty much all I have on that slide. If you want to go to the next one.
Okay.
So D, and I think Becky were asking, do judges care if you use thread conditioner or beeswax? Do they notice that as judges?
I don't really notice that. The only comment I would make on that would be anything, and this is my personal opinion, I'm always very cautious of anything I apply to my threads. I used to use Thread Heaven and all that years and years ago when it came out, and I used to run my threads over like a wet sponge to straighten them. And I haven't done that in a really long time. I'm always afraid, especially as I've gotten more experienced and do more complicated pieces, I'm always afraid of things that will leave a residue on the thread that will before the end of my lifetime become a problem and discolor or stain or deteriorate. So other than occasionally waxing a thread for beading work or some particular styles of needlework, I generally don't do it. For me, it doesn't make a difference. That's
okay.
I think giving you my personal opinion is the best advice, and I would just ask other people on that as well, but I don't have a definitive a technical aspect of how long those threads, if they'll be damaged or if they'll attract bugs, or to me the less is more of that schooling.
Okay, and Sandy wants to know about how long does it take to judge an individual piece? About how long does it take to judge a piece?
Yeah, we usually give them several minutes. Occasionally something's technical, we'll look at it a little longer. A lot of it depends on the size of the show. If you have a really large show and you've only got so many hours sometimes or days, you have to go through them and keep moving. At a smaller show, while you can spend more time on them, you sort of get into a rhythm where you take a piece. My way of doing it is I take the piece, I like to look at the whole thing, and then I start looking at it in different sections or from top to bottom, depends what the image is that I'm looking at. And then I look at it closely. I'll take my magnifier and check it for technique issues. But usually it's pretty quickly, it's within a couple of minutes, because you have to look at the piece, you have to evaluate the piece, and you have to score the piece. And in some places they ask you to write some comments regarding the piece. And then you also have to leave time, once all of your divisions are done, you have to choose, best of class, you have to choose best of division, best of show, judges awards, any other specialty awards. So we try to go through them thoroughly, but at a good, steady, quick pace.
Okay. And then Becky wants to know, how do you get two threads to lay side by side?
A couple ways to do it. If you're using something just like two threads in your needle that are fairly thin, like a DMC cotton or a Veriswa silk, the quick and easy way to do it is you can just use your sewing needle, and as you bring your thread, you bring your thread up for the first part of the stitch, then you go over and you're bringing it back down. You kind of put the needle through them to separate them. That's the quick way to do it. It's hard to explain without demonstrating and moving my hands around. The other way to do it is learning to use a laying tool, which you would generally need two hands for. And then in that case, you bring the threaded needle up. So whether it's two threads or four threads or whatever, you bring it up, you bring the needle over and back down through your fabric or canvas. And the way I do it is as I pull the thread back behind the canvas, I stick the point of my laying tool underneath the threads, and I kind of glide it a little back and forth. It's sort of a feel, and I get them to sit side by side on the tool, and I sort of gently guide the threads down as I tighten the thread through the canvas. I hope that makes sense. There's some really good videos online if anyone has any technique questions and you don't quite understand what I'm explaining, or I don't have time, that today there are really great resources. The internet is wonderful. Okay. So this next picture here, this is a piece. This is some of my good work. This is an original piece. It's a hardanger piece. It was actually designed as the hardanger step in my Master Craftsman program, and it's a very large piece. And so this gives you an example of some of the things we look for in hardanger and other types of white work. So on this particular piece, the blanket stitch, which is the stitch that's on the edge, has been cut away from the fabric very cleanly. For those of you that don't know hardanger, this piece was originally a large solid piece of fabric. So I had to cut away the edges. Anywhere you see the little lacy work, the filling work inside, I had to cut threads and remove them, and then I do the lacy filling stitches inside. They're not fabric threads. So there's a lot of detail work in hardanger. It's a lot of fun. But so the blanket stitch edges have to be cut very cleanly. The bars, Gary, if you want to go in just a little closer on any of those woven bars, yeah, like right there. The little one open work on the upper left side, those are called dove's eyes, and they're made with several different stitches. So you'll notice that those are all the same size, where they're open in the middle, and they're all very nicely centered. The bars that they're attached to are woven bars on this particular one, so the thread goes in and out, weaves it like a little pattern. Those are properly done with tension and with the right amount of wraps. The wrong amount of wraps would make them either bend in and out because there's too much thread on them, or they would be loose and they wouldn't sit properly. So one tip, if you do hardanger work, if you have little thread nubbies sticking up after you finish, if you're doing it in white traditionally, or if you're using threads that are color fast and can be washed, if you give it a rinse with cold water when you're done and let it dry, and then iron it gently and carefully, as it dries, it'll shrink the fabric threads back in. So where you can't quite get up to them with the back of the scissor, it'll pull them in most of the way. There's also, I would have to look at the scissor blade. There's also a certain way you hold the scissor blade to those so that you have less of a chance of cutting your threads. And if you cut your threads, they can be repaired. There's ways of fixing it. It's not too heartbreaking. It only seems like it in the moment. Next slide.
Yeah, this one I just
But
wanted to comment because having done my share of woven bars there, that was the thing that caught my eye immediately. It's really nicely done. They're so even.
oh, thank you. I passed the when I submitted this, I passed it on the first try, which was nice because they allow
Oh,
you
Wow,
several tries.
oh,
And
that's
actually,
great.
and this is a good time guys, to mention. People ask, do we judge the back of your work? That's a very common question that I get. Uh, Generally speaking, we do not look at the back of your work. But in a case of something like this was originally not mounted. It was supposed to be a table piece, and then some other things came up, and I decided to frame it. Um, when this is submitted, if it was loose and not in a frame, we would look at the back of it to see how everything is neat and the ends are all tied in and they're not distorting anything on the front. There are no trimmings, no the loose ends we were just talking about. They are not sticking up any place. So this is the type of work where we would look at both the front and the back.
yeah. We talked about
Okay.
the back in the podcast, and where the back comes into play is if it forces a change on the front.
Mm-hmm.
If it degrades the front
Right.
in any way, then yeah.
If you can see it somehow on the front, whether it's distorting or it shows through, or yeah, if it affects the front, then that's where it's a problem. But if we can't see it on the front, then you're good, especially if it's framed,
Yeah.
framed or finished with, if it's a stand-up piece or something. So
Yep.
that's pretty
All right.
much all I have on that.
Matthew had one.
So
Yeah, a question. So Sandy asked, are dimensional pieces accepted in shows or only flat types of work?
oh, anything.
Okay.
Always look through your exhibit guide, and that will tell you how and where you should enter it in what category and what class. The more the merrier. The shows will take pretty much anything. So, and if you have any questions about something that's not covered in the guide that you in a show that you want to enter, by all means, do not hesitate to contact their designated person with questions. They will find out and they will let you know. Again, the whole goal is to encourage and welcome people to entering the shows.
Right.
Okay, so I'm sorry, any question?
Just one more question. Is there anything in particular you look for in a piece with back stitching?
Yes, the back stitches the tension should be such that they are pulled straight, that the back stitching is consistent, as in when you go back, do you place the needle above or below the thread in front of it, or do you pierce the thread? So consistency in tension and consistency in the method in which you're making the stitch are what we look for. And also that it's, when you're changing threads or starting and ending threads, same thing, that those ends are not poofing up just a little bit and that they're not secure. Okay, so this next picture is an example of cross stitch, and this is actually taken off of the piece that I'm working on right now. So you'll see there's a little bit of a basting stitch on the right. That's all that little series of back stitches is just for counting, because it's very small and it sort of floats out in the middle of nowhere. So I don't know how well that will enlarge. You can give it a try if you want, but I will talk while you do that. Yeah, that's okay. Let's leave it like that. Sort of hard. It's a little hard to see because it's done in silk, so there's a bit of a sheen no matter how I photograph it. So this is an example of a fairly solid piece of stitching. All the stitches should cross in the same direction. A big thing is don't overuse your thread lengths. We'll see an example of that in a minute or two, and I'm going to wait to talk about that a little more when you can actually see a visual example. Make sure all the stitches are actually crossed. If you have me as a judge, I will look for that because that's my specialty. I find the missing cross stitches. Be careful when you tie them off, as we were just talking, so that they don't pull the tension tighter under certain stitches. You'll lose your nice visual evenness and sheen. Type of threads don't matter. Someone had asked in a question earlier, do judges care if you use cotton threads versus silk threads as an example? No, Nope, this particular one is a Veriswa silk. It could as easily have been done with the proper weight of a cotton thread. I just use what I happen to like to use. You should use what you like to use. And if two pieces with the same exact thing are side by side with different materials, um, unless there's a really big issue as far as function as to why something shouldn't be used, in an image such as this on a sampler, it would make no difference. It really just comes down to your technique and how you've executed that stitch.
Cindy, one thing that I've asked myself several times, right there where you can see the ground cloth through particularly dark colors, is that
Mm-hmm.
does that call? Do judges notice that? Does it matter, or is that just accepted as you can't always cover
You know,
everything?
it depends on, you do, I'll go to the next slide because you can see it even better on the next one because we're going to talk about over one, and that was also something I have on that one. So go ahead and enlarge that just a little bit, especially so we can see some of the, I'll go to the left so we can see both some of the dress and some of the other background. Maybe not enlarge it quite so much.
Okay.
So,
Ah,
so this particular, oh, there it
just a
goes.
minute, we lost it all.
So this pick image is of some over one work done in variations of continental and tent and basket weave, depending on the size of the motifs. One of the things, and then I'll talk about over one in a second, but to answer your question, um, I find that different colors adhere and change the consistency and density of threads a little differently on the type of threads that I've been using. So I struggle with if I'm using a light or off-white piece of linen, as in this case, I had sort of an ecru color, and I have dark threads. You're going to see a little bit through the back. Now you have to remember these images that we're looking at are very close up. So when I'm looking at them as a whole without my magnifier glass, it is not as noticeable as it is when we've got our noses into it like a judge would. Um, I try to control some of that by spinning and unspinning my needle a little bit to control some of the consistency of the coverage. Um, Red is really hard to work with sometimes. I love red, but boy, it just seems to take the dye and thin itself out a little bit as far as coverage goes compared to some of the golds and some of the greens that I use. And that's just my personal experience with this thread talking. So if we notice as a judge that there is an awful lot of fabric showing through the back there, we may ding it a little bit. If it looks like you're trying to do good thread handling, and we realize it's just sometimes the way these threads take, especially when you're working on linen, and in linen, some of the weave itself goes from very, very thin to very thick individual pieces of thread in the fabric itself, and it's impossible to control every little thing. So we do sort of make some allowances depending on how the technique is and what the coverage is. And we try to be very considerate of all that because sometimes there's just not a whole lot you can do about it.
Yeah. Okay.
That's my way of looking at it. Now you may ask someone else, another judge may look at it a little differently, but I do a lot of reproduction work. I've done a lot of these fairly solid over one pieces, and that's the problem that I've run into. And it's not so much a matter of like my first inclination would be to say, well, that person is not using the right weight of thread. I actually on these, so I've experienced how the thread goes. If I try to go up to something slightly thicker, it will be so thick. I think this is 40 count linen over one. I won't be able to stitch on it. So
Yeah.
a knowledge as a judge of materials and techniques, that's where all of this training comes in handy.
Mm-hmm.
So other things on this piece, the red on her dress, the darker red where it's a little bit of a mottled looking, is a technique in thread handling that was used. If you're using overdyed pieces, I converted this piece to all overdyes instead of solid colors, so the color was the same in the thread, but it would vary from darker to lighter. And in the red in the dress in this picture, I had to be very careful. If I simply stitched rows of basket weave back and forth, I would have had diagonal stripes of color going through that whole dress, and it would have been it wouldn't have looked very good to my eye. So I wanted it to look a little more mottled and sun faded and antique-y. So I actually worked little blobs of color as I stitched to sort of spread the colors out in a certain way, and I placed them very carefully. And I wrote that on my art statement so that the judges knew I did that, by the way. So
Okay, all right.
there's there's an example of something I would share with the judges. I changed the threads, I changed them to over dyes, I did a few other things on this, and I did use this, explained this technique that I used for color handling so that it would not appear very stripy. Something else as on technique for over one is people have a tendency to pull it very tight. Something that I learned when I first learned over one on silk, when we all stitch, when we take that needle back down through to the back of the fabric and get ready to pull up for the next stitch, we all have a tendency pretty much subconsciously to give it that last little final tug to sort of seat the stitch, and it becomes very automatic. When you're doing over one work, whether it's cross stitch or a tent stitch, try not to give it that last little tug because it leaves the thread ever so lightly softer looking. It's not, I don't want to use the word fluffy is coming to mind, and that's not what I want. It leaves it a little more puffed in texture, and it just sits together with the threads adjacent to it so much more nicely than pulling it down too tight. And that also helps control some of that thin thread a little bit too. Some areas better than others. This particular piece has this one gone out? This one is, I'm trying to remember which one this is. I think that's Rising Doves. I think that's gotten a first place. I've done another piece in this technique, Hannah Carter, which got a first place in a few shows, and it also got the Princess Grace Award at the ANG National exhibit a few years ago, which utterly floored me because the people that compete for that, I entered it against it, but I had no expectation of winning because the Princess Grace Award there's several people that enter that every year and they do phenomenal work. And I was just floored that I actually won with a reproduction sampler. So
that's quite amazing. That's
but it was very similar in feel to this piece. But don't over pull on your over one work. You don't want it loose, but you don't want to give it that last little final tug. And it's just something that takes a lot of practice and forethought as you're doing it to accomplish. Just makes it look a little nicer.
Yep.
All right. Here's a question. What if you're like doing something you want a more primitive, thinner coverage versus a thicker coverage look? Would you put that in your artist statement, you think, or?
Always good to put information in the artist statement. You can never go wrong. You don't want to write a book, but it's always good to give us little bits of information. And if we can see that the coverage is consistent through the entire piece and it doesn't look like it's a mistake, then we can see that it's part of the technique. Or we should be able to see it's part of the technique in most cases. Once in a while, you may get a judge and say, you may want to, use a slightly heavier thread for a little better coverage. And if they didn't quite understand that you were using that thread specifically, you just sort of have to go, okay, and overlook it. We try to be as well trained and psychic, knowing what you're exhibiting and what you're trying to tell us. If it's not written down, we try our best, but every once in a while, we may not have realized that you're trying for something, and there's nowhere to write it to let us know. So,
right.
Okay. So,
and one more question on cross stitch. Are Danish and English methods of cross stitch judged differently? So mixing them in one piece seems to create different looking crosses.
As long as you're consistent in what you're doing, it should be fine. Again, it's all consistency in technique and thread direction on the front, unless, like I said, you're doing a reproduction sampler and threads cross all over the place. There's always exceptions to everything. But no, as long as your thread tension and your thread execution is correct on the front and it's all consistent and it all looks like it's been handled with, care and technically done right, that's really what you're looking for. Because remember, if we're not seeing the back, we may not quite, see what stitch path is going on behind there.
Right.
So this next slide is, oh, we've got a couple things going on here. Someone was asking about back stitches, so I'll talk about those first. This particular piece, this is actually the reversible sampler that I've referred to a few times. This is actually the back of the sampler for anyone that's interested. Is some double running stitch going on, and there's some black work. So those are all the different types of black work and running stitches on there. And you can see on them, there are no threads traveling underneath any open areas. There are no little thread bits sticking up. An interesting technique, which I mentioned on Sunday's show, is the pin stitch for hiding threads where you don't really have a place to hide them. And it's a stitch that is particularly useful on black work and running stitches if you're not doing them next to any solid stitches like cross stitches or satin stitches where you would normally hide them. And you can usually just maneuver them and tuck them very carefully underneath. And it takes some practice. I see a couple. This has not been framed yet. I actually see a piece on the lower right-hand corner that I need to go in and adjust. There's a blue stitch that looks a little fluffy that I have to go and make sure that that is correct and not just a shadow. Yep, right there.
Yep, I see it. Yeah.
Yep, you see it. That hasn't been framed yet. That's one of my ones that need to go down. So that's probably the pin stitch showing up from under there. So I have to either redo that section or manipulate it a little bit to make it look pretty. But hey, it's the back.
Well, I was going to say
in this case,
reversible
it's reversible.
piece, yeah.
So yeah, it's
Nice.
reversible, and it will be framed reversible. So it'll be judged reversible. The other technique that's all over this particular section are satin stitches. So you can see in general, I have to still go through them to finish them up properly, but these are all in general laid very smoothly side by side. This particular piece was done with a single thread in the needle. So instead of laying 2 threads at a time and going from, one set of holes into the next, to the next, to the next, I tried a different technique, which the designer of this piece recommended. And I went through each hole once, and then I went through a second time with the same thread, and then moved to the next set of holes and did a double stitch in the hole. And what was nice about that is I had a few areas where the linen threads change size, like I was talking about a few minutes ago. So occasionally I would put a third or even a fourth stitch in one of those places to make it nice and full. And I need to go over this piece still with an afficot, like a burnishing tool, just to sort of make sure they're all sitting properly before they go visit the framer. Let's try saw. Oh, Gary, if you go the acorn that's facing down on the center left, you can see there's a thick linen thread that's right next to it. And just for people that don't stitch on linen, so yeah, if you slide it over just a little bit, move that center medallion over a little bit to the right.
Easier said than done.
Okay.
No, I can't do it now.
Oh, that's fine. Okay, you know what? Stop right there. And if everybody looks to the very, very, very left of their screen, there's a couple of running stitches floating out into space. And if you look, you can actually see there's about the third thread over from the left border. You can see a really thick piece of linen coming down. And for those of you that don't stitch on linen and are not familiar with how the threads change in weight, there's an example of a thick one, and they can sometimes be very thick or very thin. So that just caught my eye to point out.
Yep.
So are you going to frame it with glass on both sides?
Yeah, that's the plan right now.
Glass on both sides. Okay.
I'm going to go talk to the framers. I have some really great framers out here that I use. I'm going to take that and another large sampler, and then you'll hear me scream and hit the floor when they tell me how much it's all going to cost.
Yeah.
But they do a beautiful job. They do a beautiful job. So I will have it framed, and there will be glass on both sides of it so that you can see both sides, because it is reversible, and I want it to be able to be seen from the back, and I want to frame it. So I like to frame things. So if there's no questions on that one, we can go to the next slide.
All right.
Okay. Now this is back to one of my very old pieces, and I'm very, very old. I might have been maybe around 10 or 12 when I did this. So now this is an example of, and I'm sure those of you that are experienced needle pointers can look at it and go, oh, that's basket weave. And look at those diagonal lines going
Yep.
all through that
Yep.
thing. If you saw the back of it, it's horrible on the back. It's so horrible. And I just wove those threads, and the diagonal, I didn't know any better. I had learned from a book. I was originally self-taught until I got married and joined EGA and learned a whole new world of things. So basket weave, we look for those diagonal pulls. You want to end your threads either vertically or horizontally, preferably stitch over them using a waist knot or a waist knot. It blends them in and it doesn't affect the tension on the front of your pieces. If you're able to, Gary, enlarge a little bit right there, perfect. Okay, underneath between the scroll and the leaves, if you guys look, you can see there is an very good example there of how your thread will wear when it is too long. This was cotton thread. This was supposed to be a chair seat. This is cotton thread because, as I said, I'm allergic to cats. I'm also allergic to wool. So I do try to avoid wool in my own stitching, just for that reason. But it's a really great example because you can see I overused threads terribly on this. And you can see where there's nice new threads started. They're nice and tight. And you can see the individual stitches. They're pretty decent. And then all of a sudden they get fuzzy. And if you looked at them, if you were holding it and looked at it, you would see how it loses its sheen as well. So I have no clue, it was so long ago, how long those threads were, but they were very long, I'm sure. So it's a matter of, oh, my threads are starting to lose their luster, or they're starting to get a little fuzzed. You're cutting your threads too long, cut them shorter. If you're using, a lot of people like to try and use like an arm's length or a forearm's length. Cut them down about 4 or 5 inches shorter and see how that goes. Some threads will wear faster than others, but it's better to be a little short on the threads rather than too long, even though you have to start and stop more often. And I know none of us like to do that. We want to get to the stitching part. We need the stitching fairy to come do our ends.
Right.
No, but this is really an excellent example of that. That really shows up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I took that one. I had to dig deep into the back of the cupboard to find that, and I wasn't even sure I had them because I'm originally from Rhode Island, and my father, when he sent my car out many, many years ago, he threw a bunch of stuff in the trunk, and I opened the trunk when the car brought 3,000 miles to California, and he said, "Oh, I put a few things in the back for you." Okay, Dad. And this thing had come across country on the very front of a car carrier, and was covered in bugs and everything. It was awful. And I popped the trunk open and he had posters from my bedroom. It was embarrassing to my husband. And he had all this needlework that I had done as a kid. And I was like, oh, okay. So it's, been packed away. I throw nothing away. So it's come in handy all these years later to be able to show examples without picking on anyone else.
All right,
So those are the
here's a
main
good
points
question.
on that one. Mm-hmm.
What do you look at in a corner, and that's in quotation marks, or one hole where 4 stitches all share the same hole? Sometimes threads overlap or have been pierced in that space. How does that affect judging?
Depending on the stitches, if they're not supposed to be pierced, we don't like to see them pierced. So do the best you can to try and scoot your needle around a little in the hole to try and get a relatively clean portion of the hole, which again is really difficult in the question that you're asking, because sometimes things are just, if you're doing, say, an eyelet or something, or different stitches that are meeting together. Do the best you can to not catch another stitch. Also, when you're pulling the stitch through and over, it's another type of stitch where we have a tendency, as we move the needle and come back up through the fabric for starting the next stitch, that's an area where we also give that last little tug to seat it, and we don't even realize we're doing it a lot of the time. Try not to give it that full stitch, that last little tug. And the only other thing I can think of is in the case where you're doing something like eyelets, which I don't believe is what the question is about, but as an example, when you're doing an eyelet and you're pulling the center because you want the center open, your 4 corners on the outside of the eyelet will have a tendency to pull a little tighter, and they'll open up those corner holes if you're doing a square one. So what you want to be careful of is where you're actually pulling your threads. Don't pull them on those corner stitches. Leave them not loose, but don't give them a huge amount of tension. Do your pulling on one or two of those center stitches a little bit at a time, and it'll start opening it up, and it won't distort the exterior part of the stitch quite as much. And I hope that kind of answered that question. If not, would that person let Beth know, and I'll try and answer it differently.
Makes me want to go look at some eyelets. Oops.
Oh, eyelets and yeah, eyelets and smirdas, anything like that you want, anything that has corners or joining threads, and you're stitching in opposite, you're pulling your threads in opposite direction from stitch to stitch. Not only do you have to watch your stitch path, you have to watch your stitch tension, because you'll start pulling things apart. And that's how we can see people that are, handling their technique at upper levels, because they don't have some of those issues. Yeah. And they're not bad issues. It's just you learn as you take classes and experience, and hopefully get helpful feedback from your judges. So you learn what to watch for, and you learn how to compensate for it, and to move forward and, do it a little differently on your next piece.
Yep.
So you can get rid of that picture. Okay. This is a more recent piece, so we had to follow up with this one. This is something I made for an event for my son. And this piece here is showing multiple types of stitches against each other, compensating stitches. So if you want to maybe somewhere in that rainbowy top, or anywhere there is fine too. You'll see where there are a lot of partial or compensated stitches. So when we see work like this, and this particular piece is very fully coveraged, because it's going to be used, I didn't want to have open or lacy stitches that would catch on things in the future. You need to make sure that you do your stitch compensations, and you do them properly. We will look to see if you're missing a stitch, if a stitch is out of the design path, so to speak. So say one of those purple stitches went too far up into the red, or vice versa. So you've lost your path a little on the design. You can see where the stitches, like where the tangerine orange goes to the orange underneath it. You can see where they look like some tent stitches, but if you pay attention, it is just a portion of the stitch in the tangerine color to keep the sort of vertical image of the color change into the next stitch, which is also compensated in many areas below it. And it looks nice and smooth and even and full, and the stitch rhythms don't get visually muddled up, because it just continues nice and smoothly. Your eye follows right along with it. Is there anything else on that? I have notes.
Well, the compensation on that is fabulous.
Thank you. Sorry, I was taking a sip of water.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Look at speaking of that, Beth, look at that right in there. But that's
just one of my better pieces.
Yeah, that's really nice.
And I will say I don't do as much needlepoint. My particular love is linen, hand-dyed linen, and hand-dyed silks. That's, if you give me a choice of what I want to do. While I do many, many things and I enjoy them all, right now I'm very much into silk and linen. I had to stop a few years ago to make some items for my son, and while I was making certain items for my son, I realized my husband hadn't had the items either, and we've been married a very long time, so I had to do a number of things for both of them on canvas. Yeah. I did a pretty good job. I was very happy with them.
Yeah,
as were they, or as are they. Yeah, thank you. So compensation, that had a lot of compensation in it.
Yeah.
This piece here is an example of the use of some specialty fibers and how to deal with them. Are you able to show the very top of that image or did it get cropped? Oh, there we go. Okay, what I want to see is the very, very top, where you can actually see those threads, the knots of the thread into the white canvas, if we can get that to show. because these threads were so thick, and this
Let
is
me
a
see.
class
Let
that
me
I
see how
took.
big. That's as big as I can go.
Yeah, okay. What you can't see is along the very top of the image, but underneath where it would be matted and framed. These were very, very thick pieces of like cotton twine, almost like household type of threads. And what I learned, this was a class I took, we did an away waist knot. The knot is actually left outside of the stitching area because all of this work is done on top of the canvas. And then it's done connected similarly at the bottom. Um, the knots are left in this one because there's nowhere to weave the ends on the back.
Mm.
So you have to make sure if you're doing things with certain really large specialty fibers and you have a framer that you work with or are going to work with, check with them to find out what margin you can leave in that you can tie off threads and that they know not to cut them. Because if these threads got cut, all of this image,
Oh,
it's all of the there's riders coming out of the forest, and this is the forest in the winter. These would all come loose and it would have ruined all the work that I did. So there are different methods of tying things off. Great way to learn about those is with teachers in classes, fellow stitchers that have done similar pieces. So the point of this was to say you don't always have to tie off and weave your threads underneath or do away waist knots where you stitch over them. Sometimes you come into an area or a technique where you want to accomplish something and it's just not physically possible to do that. So this particular piece is knotted slightly away from where the image ends, yet under where it would be framed and matted.
So that's a skilled framer too, to be able to deal with the lumps of thread there on the edges. Wow.
Yeah, yeah. And it's also shadow boxed on the framing on this one because there's a lot of textural work. Some of
Hmm.
the beads that are showing, like on the horses, are very large.
Oh yeah, I
This was a
see.
really fun piece. Took me a
Yeah.
long time. A lot of compensation stitches in that one as well.
Yes. Yes.
But you
Wow.
can see
mhm.
where the threads, they're actually on the bottom, like above the white horse's mane, where it makes a U on the bottom, and then it goes up and it splits off into a V for the branches of the tree.
Yeah.
That's a single piece of thread, and I did it. It is actually looped, and I have it, attached, hidden, but attached onto the canvas just above the horse's mane, and then I wove it and did an occasional attachment through the canvas so that it wouldn't wiggle and come out of place. So there are some attachments on it, but there's no way to tie off that thread. It's woven, but it's a really, really thick, almost like a household twine or cording type of thread.
It's
So
really,
that was just
really, really interesting. All of that, but you get that perfect effect of winter tree branches. It really worked. Wow.
Mhm.
A lot of
yeah,
work.
some of the threads were there's several different threads in there, and some of them were actually sort of unspun and separated and then tacked down, if I remember right, to give the feel. I really wanted the feel that the riders were exiting the forest, and when you look at the completed piece, to me, I feel I accomplished what I wanted to do on that piece. So, but
Hmm.
I thought it was interesting to show here because it's an unusual way of attaching things, and sometimes people want to put things on canvas and it's how do I tie these ends off, where do they
Right.
go?
Right.
There's ways of doing it,
Right.
there's ways of
Yeah.
being creative. And again, I
Yeah.
learned this from a
Oops.
teacher, so it's not original.
Yep.
Okay,
Okay.
you go to the next one if you like.
Yep. Did. Yep.
Okay. Okay. Now this is an example. We're going to talk for a few minutes about finishing and framing and seams, stand-ups, ornaments, tabletop things. Seams should be straight. Cording should be attached firmly. This is an example you can see along the top. This is an older piece that was self-finished at the time when I went through that period and wasn't very good at it. You can see that the top is not straight. The mat's also cut a little bit wonky because it was a self-cut mat. I don't do that anymore. I leave it to the professionals. Now I worked a number of years now. I could afford to do differently. Um, but you can see from left to right, it gets smaller and you can see the distinct angle. So this was a really good example of what we look at in finishing. If it should be straight, that should be straight across. If the framer leaves 2 threads or 4 threads around the piece or under a band, it should be 4 threads along that entire band. It shouldn't be 4 threads and 3 threads and 4 threads. Once in a while there's, I mean, things happen. This work we do is not 100% perfect, but a really good framer should be able to get your pieces nice and straight. If it needs to be blocked, have it blocked. Get it back and straight. If you're working on canvas, let the well, I recommend letting the professionals do it. It's not something I personally do myself. I don't know as much about that because it's not my skill. I like to leave it to the professionals that do it nice and pretty. But that's an example of one of the things we see often in framing, and that will lose you some points. May only be a couple points, but we'll take a few points off in finishing on it.
Okay.
And if you want to go to, go ahead.
There was a real quick question. Who was the designer of the previous piece?
Which one was that? The
forest.
The horse.
Oh, the forest. Joan Thomason. Russian Fairy Tale is the title of the piece. It's one of her older pieces. I finished it probably about 5 or so years ago, and I had taken the class about 10 years prior to that and had been working on it on and off. Took some time off when my son was really little and I didn't really have stitching time, and then finally finished it. And I laughed because it took me 10 years. And I have a bear that she also designed, a 3-dimensional bear that is in my cupboard, and one day I intend to finish that as well, but that's going to be more than 10 years.
All right, last one.
Last one. This is an example of framing that overwhelms your needlework. When you have something framed or sent out to a finisher that's a tabletop piece or an ornament, sometimes mats and frames can be chosen that overwhelm the piece. So the rule of thumb for judging is your eye should go to the needlework. The needlework is what we're looking for. Sometimes you have to get through the bows and the ribbons and the fluff to see the needlework. Sometimes, as in this case, you have to get through a very oversized frame for a very tiny piece, and it overwhelms it. That said, something that we mentioned the other day, you are doing your work and should finish it the way you want. We are judging it, as I said earlier, for really only a matter of minutes. And then we're letting the public go see it and enjoy it and ooh and ah over it. You're taking it home to love and care for it thereafter. Finish it the way you want it. If you want an oversized frame, as I did with this piece, it was a style I wanted to do, and that's the frame that came with it, and I really liked it, and that's how I put it together. If you're a fan of those big ribbons and fluffy bows, by all means, do them. They're beautiful. They are absolutely exquisite, and they're a certain give a certain style to the piece. But as far as judging goes, if you're entering a piece, do be aware that if it truly overwhelms your work and is very outsized for it, you may lose a few points on the judging.
So this is interesting because as a judge, you would take points off, but as the stitcher, this is the way you wanted it, and so you did it the way you wanted it, even though the judge side of your head says no.
Exactly. I liked the frame. I believe I got it with the piece, perhaps because it fits really small over one piece. It's very cute. And I just really liked the real burly looking wood, and that's what it went in. And I have a couple small pieces around that are like that. They're sort of oversized on the frame because I liked the frame. It's not necessarily something that I would put in a show expecting to win a great ribbon over. The things that I'm going to put in the shows when I exhibit, I keep in mind how I'm framing it or finishing it. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of it's a different purpose, or as in the case of that needlepoint, that colorful needlepoint case you saw a few minutes ago, that eventually may enter a show. I'll have to steal it back from my son for a couple of weeks, but it was made for him for a specific purpose and for longevity versus a show, but that could go either way. It's done really nice and it may go to a show. But if I wanted to finish something with a super fancy laser cut mat, I'm going to look at it. It's only going to the show for a couple of weeks. It's only going to the judge for a few minutes. Finish it how you want it, and then go from there. If you're looking specifically to finish it to get prizes, then you might want to just keep some of that in mind.
Yeah. All right, going to put us back on screen. We're going to wrap up here, I think.
Okay, just real quick question. Do you know if that designer is Heart's Content for that last piece?
Oops. I'm sorry, say it again. You're cut out.
Heart's Content. Is that the designer? Do you know on that
Yes.
last piece?
Yes, it is.
Yep.
It's an old one. I think it had a 1999 date if I looked at the corners on that. So I've had that for a while, but she might still have it.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Okay, Cindy. Boy, thanks, folks, for all the questions. Hope you got something out of it. If you haven't listened to the podcast Sunday, more of this, which will help you. And hope this was valuable to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Hour and a half here. Thanks for hanging in there. But fantastic job, Cindy. Really learned a lot.
I'll talk as long as you let me.
No, really
Thank you.
learned a
Thank you
lot.
for having me back. It was fun.
Yeah, it was excellent. All right. Thanks to everybody. And we'll see. I hope to see everybody Friday when we gather for World Embroidery Day. And thanks again, Cindy. Really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye.